Hi, Sam. Thanks for joining us today. I think you're joining us today from the UK and not from Orlando, US. That's right. And Sam will talk about cybersecurity for midstream operators, lessons learned from Colonial Pipeline. Sam is a mechanical engineer and American attorney. He runs Siemens Energy cybersecurity business for the oil and gas and industrial applications business. Sam has more than 8 years of experience with this industry, working at Siemens and Siemens Energy on the ground in North America, Africa, and Middle East. Thanks again, Sam, for joining us today. Please, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, and thank you to everybody on the call for joining us. So what I wanted to kind of talk about is, I think, the biggest cybersecurity incident in the midstream world that we have faced to date. This is me. But first, just a little bit to make sure everybody knows who Siemens Energy is. You know, we spun off of Siemens AG about a year ago. We are a major manufacturer of equipment in the generation space and the transmission space and the renewable space through our ownership of 2/3 of Siemens Gamesa, the wind business, the new energy business, things like hydrogen, power generation, electrolyzers, and then industrial applications, which is really where I specialize, which is our oil and gas business, as well as supporting process industries, pulp and paper, and things like that. And really, we see that oil and gas companies are under immense pressure to go digital. The evolving business models have resulted in the whole industry realizing that digitalization is how you get a competitive advantage. But obviously, cybersecurity has to be at the core of any digitalization effort. We're also seeing distributed energy production. So we're moving away from large power stations and more towards generation of the electricity needed on site. And that increases the attack surface because you have more plants, more locations. We're also seeing a lot more connectivity. Now, part of the distributed nature of the business is enabled by that connectivity. And that causes increased efficiency. But again, this all increases your cybersecurity attack surface. And then finally, we have the constant pressures that this industry always has had on increasing efficiency. And digital is an important part of that. But industrial cyber is really this new risk frontier. So if we think back on the last 10 years, our first real experience with a hack of an industrial control system was the virus Dooku in 2011. And as you can see in this little timeline we have below, sort of every couple years, things gets worse. In 2012, started to see attempts to get into SCADA systems. In 2015, we see success in shutting down the Ukrainian grid. 2018, we start to see attempts not on sort of a developing world energy system, but in the US. And then 2021, we all saw the Colonial Pipeline incident. And we've done some surveys, and we've really seen that the whole industry understands that these issues are not really getting better. They're getting worse, and our industry is getting more attacked. So just to make sure everybody, because Colonial Pipeline had different amounts of media coverage around the world. So on May 6th, 100 gigabytes of data was stolen from Colonial Pipeline. And this is what we call a double ransomware attack. So the attackers not only stole data and threatened to release it if not paid, but they also encrypted the hard drives of the affected computers so that Colonial Pipeline wasn't able to use them anymore. Now, the CEO has admitted to Congress and the media that they paid almost 75 Bitcoin, which is about $5 million to the hackers. But they got a decryption tool back from the hackers, which is what they offer you when you pay the ransom. That was really slow. Now, it was probably really slow because the hackers have no incentive to write an efficient decryption tool. But also, you think about the level of computer hardware in a lot of the OT environment, and often that's not super high-speed computers. Again, hackers don't care if it takes a little while for the machines to get encrypted, but decryption, time is of the essence as you're trying to recover from an attack. Colonial Pipeline says the attack didn't reach the OT environment, but what we see here is that because of the other impacts on Colonial Pipeline's operations, the impact to their customers was that they still shut down the pipeline, even though the hack might not have gotten all the way through to the OT environment. And we saw shortages of fuel across the US East Coast. So this really became a major safety and national security issue in the United States in a matter of about 2 days. And so we know that operators are really challenged to understand and address their blind spots when it comes to cybersecurity. There's a lack of visibility into what's even on your network. There's a lot of consultants and entities out there. I would say also some IT services companies that go to OT operators, go to midstream companies and say, well, just treat it like IT. And I think anyone who's tried a project like that realizes there's some serious problems with that approach. There's been a lack historically of investment in cybersecurity as a key training point for operators at plants. A lot of plants don't have a response plan for a cybersecurity incident. Now, if you think about that, that kind of makes sense, because if they don't have visibility in the operating assets, then how are you going to have a response plan to a hack? We're also seeing, human capital gaps as far as it is difficult, even for a company like Siemens Energy that specializes in this, to hire an adequate number of people who have the skills and experience to really support OT environments and support operators. You also see a lack of alignment sometimes between OT and IT security, where an IT department has one expectation for what might be possible and reasonable, and when the operators, the idea that you might reboot your computers on a regular basis is probably not tenable. And then finally, we have zero-day risks, where especially now that some of these hacks have resulted in large payments, it's not just a random attack. It's not just a script kiddie. It's people actually targeting our industry. And so there's been a big regulatory response to this. And we just have a sample on the left of this. And really the way we see the regulations coming is by changing the classification of what is critical infrastructure. But the concern we have and the problem we are helping a lot of companies in this space deal with right now is that the regulations are moving much faster than the usual capital expenditure budgets and planning processes of operators in the oil and gas industry. And so the real nightmare for operators is regulations that get proposed, approved, and come into effect before the operator even has a chance to start their own cybersecurity journey and really start figuring out how to get their arms around this problem. And truthfully, that's when these regulations go from being manageable and sort of encouraging best practices to being something that is very expensive and difficult, because now suddenly there's an enormous time pressure. So we think that the whole industry, that there's 3 big things that should be learned as we all think about how we improve our cybersecurity situation going forward based on what happened in Colonial Pipeline. So the first one is that air gapping isn't adequate. So I think the traditional cybersecurity defense that a lot of operators have used has said, well, I'm not connected to the internet. What could go wrong? Now, we know, looking all the way back to Stuxnet, that there's a history of where things can go wrong, mostly through the USB keys, which if you're air gapped, usually what you end up doing is updating your devices using, walking around a USB key. We've seen that a lot of the other parts of critical infrastructure that I would say are ahead of oil and gas in regulation went away from air gapping as the regulations came in. Because, for example, regulations like NERC-CIP, which applies to US power producers and which, we think at Siemens Energy is likely to be where things go for the pipeline operators in the US, you really can't comply with that and just stay disconnected. And so the other problem with air gapping is that, as we saw at Colonial Pipeline, the air gap can make it hard to have visibility into the OT network. So you think about, you're at a risk management meeting, you're at a crisis response meeting from some sort of a hack that happened in the IT network, and the CEO turns to the responsible people and says, well, are we still in control of our OT network? And if you're air gapped, it's very hard to give a direct answer to that. And as we saw in Colonial Pipeline, all of the incentives for the senior leadership in that situation is to say, well, we're going to shut down the operations anyway, just to be safe, because obviously these things can have serious health and safety implications to people. The other thing we learned from Colonial Pipeline is that artificial intelligence would have helped and is really the way the industry should be going. So, traditional antivirus is signature-based. That signature-based antivirus is only good if it's updated. And if you think back to what I was talking about, walking around USB keys to do updates, this is really complicated and takes a lot of time at a plant. And what we see is that for whatever reason, things just don't get updated on the basis that vendors like McAfee or other signature-based antiviruses would recommend. So what do you do about that? Well, at Siemens Energy, what we're doing and what we're encouraging our customers to do is to think about, instead of using signatures, to use artificial intelligence as their anti-malware. And what we see with that is, for example, with artificial intelligence, if you take very up-to-date McAfee and you take artificial intelligence, on day 0, the most up-to-date, they have a similar performance. But then if you say, okay, what if we don't update McAfee for 6 months, or we don't update McAfee for a year? What's the performance there? Usually artificial intelligence in those sorts of situations is something like 60 or 80% better. And it's 60 or 80% better even without an update. And so we really think that, especially in distributed situations like the midstream business, this is a real opportunity to bring new technology in to give cybersecurity benefits, but also keep from having these enormous costs of monthly updates. And then the final thing we really want to remind everybody about from Colonial Pipelines is that backups are critical, even if your organization pays the ransom. Hackers have no incentive to provide an efficient decryption tool. The best practice, if you are going to pay, is that you hire a consulting company, some sort of outside firm, to write a custom decryption software for you once you get the key from the hackers. That takes time. And even then, older computers will just take a long time to decrypt themselves. And post-attack time is of the essence. So really the fastest way to recover, regardless of whether you're going to pay, is to use a backup. I'm going to touch on this briefly, which is, again, we think that the best way to make sure especially in a crisis, if your network is hacked or not, is to be monitoring that network for anomalies, both on the OT side of the network and on the IT side of the network. So often we're starting to see companies where they'll have 1 or 2 connections between OT and IT so that they can manage the OT network better. We don't think there's anything wrong with that, but what we think you need to do is do network monitoring on both sides of that connection so that you can compare and you can see if there's bad traffic, even if there's 0-day bad traffic on the IT network from, say, an email or something. You can compare to the OT network and say, well, I don't see that traffic on the OT network, so I can confidently say we still have control of the OT network. Now, there's a lot of tools that can be used for this. At Siemens Energy, we think AI-based tools are the best because we think those are the hardest ones for targeted hackers to get around by knowing what signature files look like. But again, there's lots of ways to do this, and we really think this is the best practice for operators right now. And then the last question I just want to leave everybody on the call with is, when was the last time all of your OT endpoints were backed up, all of your HMIs, all of your engineering stations? What we see happen just operationally, the reality of the world, is that the backup point on someone in the plant's checklist is often low on the priority. It's not the thing that decides whether the plant runs today or runs tomorrow. It's the thing that's preparing for the bad day. And that means that just the nature of human beings is that sometimes this doesn't happen. And so we really think that it's important for organizations to be prioritizing automated backups that are resistant to having a ransomware attack, so that you're not adding additional tasks to already burden people in your operations. And the final thing we just remind you of is that regardless of whether you pay a ransom, if you are hacked, the good backup is what recovers your operations quicker. And truthfully, it's the cost of the operational impact that is much more expensive than even a $5 million impact from Colonial, like we saw in Colonial Pipeline. So that's our message. That's our view of things that we should learn. This is a little bit about me. That you can contact me if you've got any questions. I'm really looking forward to the Q&A session.
Yeah, thank you very much, Sam, for sharing us your lessons learned from the Colonial Pipeline incident, and especially covering the topic of the necessity of backups. So actually something quite simple and basic, but really important to stress the necessity and to also keep in mind that you really have to be fast in restoring everything, the whole system. Yeah, so we will have a joint Q&A session, like I mentioned before, at the end of the next keynote speech. So please continue on writing your questions into the chat tab section right next to this live video here. And thanks again, Sam. I would now like to move on with our last keynote speech for today.